Welcome, everybody. I'm Walter Isaacson, and this is pretty much the essence of what the Aspen Institute has been and should always be about, and frankly, what our nation should always be about. It's a notion of very dedicated people of both parties coming together and trying to find common ground. It's under the auspices of the Aspen Strategy Group. I want to thank Joe Nye, who is co-chair of the Aspen Strategy Group with Secretary Condoleezza Rice, the new co-chair, her first year in this job. We also have on stage, of course, Stephen Hadley. It's one of the first, and Tom Donilon, one of the first times that 4 national security advisors will be together. First time they've been together, and H.R. McMaster's, the current one, is coming in tomorrow. So I think it shows what Aspen can do. You may notice that Susan Rice is missing. She will actually be here in about 7 minutes. She's on her way from the airport. But just like Bob Gates last year, there's always somebody who wants to make a dramatic entrance. So I've been vamping a little bit to make it all the less dramatic, but let me turn it over to a person everybody knows, Nick Burns, the executive director of the Aspen Strategy Group and an old friend of the Institute. I do want to say, though, that you've been here many times. You've now joined the board. You're now co-chairing this. But tell them the year you first came here and why.
Well, the first year that I came here was 1972. I was at the end of my sophomore year in college, and I was a student in the Aspen Music Festival School at the time. And after experiencing all those amazing pianists in the Aspen Music Festival School, I went back to Denver and changed my major.
So good afternoon, everybody. Before Walter goes away, I think given his extraordinary leadership of the Aspen Institute over 14 years, we all ought to pay tribute to him. So thank you all for being here. I'm Nick Burns. I'm director of the Aspen Strategy Group. We are, in this group, a rare commodity in Washington, D.C. We are nonpartisan, and we're resolutely nonpartisan. We're meeting here for the 34th year. Joe and I was at that first meeting 34 years ago with Brent Scowcroft, who's now our chairman emeritus, and Bill Perry, the former Secretary of Defense. They're the founding fathers. We also have a lot of founding mothers of this institution. And we believe that Republicans and Democrats and independents can come together on behalf of our country to think through the biggest challenges we face. So we're here every August for that reason. And I want to pay tribute to Joe because he's the longest serving member of this institution and a great father intellectually of what we try to do. So Joe, thank you for what you've done. We have a lot of important people here. I have to mention our great former Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright. And I have to mention Basalt's own Ambassador Tom Korologos. And Jim Crown and Bob Steele, who've led the Aspen Institute as board chair over many years. Jim recently, Bob more in the past, but thanks to both of you. And this year we're bringing together a lot of foreign policy experts, but we're also bringing together 3 elected officials who are going to talk to us Sunday evening about the red-blue divide, about a divided nation. Walter and Jim have been running this project of healing America. And so Mayor Mitch Landrieu of New Orleans is here. We're really happy he's here today. If you have not read his speech about a very sensitive issue in his community, Confederate monuments, you must read that speech. A brilliant speech of leadership. He'll be joined by a good friend of ours, Senator Dan Sullivan of Alaska, and Congressman Joe Kennedy of Massachusetts on Sunday evening to talk about how domestic politics has an impact on our leadership position. What we're doing this week is taking on a big subject, the American-led liberal order of the last 72 years. Condi and I thought we'd both try to describe it. For 72 years, every American president from Harry Truman right through to Barack Obama, has agreed on one thing. We have to be forward deployed, engaged with the rest of the world as a leader. And that's why we created this set of alliances like NATO and our East Asian alliances. That's why we've stood for free trade and trading agreements to lift global prosperity. It's why we have nurtured these big labyrinthine institutions. They're not always perfect, like the United Nations and its agencies, the IMF, the World Bank, because we believe when there's a natural disaster that hits Haiti, an earthquake, the world's got to be ready to respond. Or an Ebola crisis, we have to respond. And that the United States is the linchpin of all this. And we believe in something else. Every president and every administration, both parties, we believe in democracy and human rights and a democratic order in the world. That is under challenge right now. It's under challenge by a rising China, which doesn't share some of those values. It's under challenge by a resurgent Russia, which of course has invaded, crossed every red line by invading and occupying and annexing Crimea, by harassing our NATO allies, by causing trouble in the Middle East, and by a cyber attack on our national election in 2016. But it's more complicated than just China and Russia, because this liberal order is also being besieged by the fact that a lot of non-governments, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, cyber terrorists, have a lot of power now. And they're cutting into the power of governments and diluting that power, and our ability to achieve a peaceful and stable world. And I must say this, and I'll try to say this in a very nonpartisan way. A lot of people are thinking now that the United States is not upholding its end of the bargain. There were many critics of President Obama who thought that he was too reticent in protecting the United States in some instances. There are many, many more critics of America First, of President Trump. So the question I wanted to ask our panelists today, Condi and Tom and Steve and Susan, when she does arrive in a couple of minutes, I want to ask three questions. Is that liberal order that's so important to our future, is it being weakened? And how can President Trump and the Congress and all of us strengthen it? That's the first question we'll take on. The second is, what do we do about Putin? Do we contain him in Europe but engage him in Asia and the Middle East? And the third question I wanted to get expert advice on is China, which I think is the most complex of all. China is not our enemy. It's our partner on climate change, our partner on global economic growth, but it's our competitor in the South and East China Sea. And how do you balance that? So those are three questions that we thought we'd take a run through each of them. And then about 45 or 50 minutes from now, we will stop that conversation and we'll turn it over to you. And please feel free to ask any question that you would like to ask. So I think it's only fair. Condi's our new co-chair. We're really delighted that she's succeeding someone who is very important in her life, Brent Scowcroft. Condi, take it away.
Well, thanks, Nick. And let me just say thank you very much to all of you for being here, because what we need more than anything at this point is civic and civil dialogue about a number of the important issues that we face. Nick, I wouldn't just pick up with your description of the liberal order, because I think we have to realize that the liberal order was born. It was an idea designed after World War II. When people looked out at the world that they had inherited after World War I and said, let's not do that again. And it had two important elements, and it had one important fact. One element was they really believed that the international economy did not have to be a zero-sum game. It could be competitive, but it could be a growing economy and a positive-sum game, so my gains were not your losses. And that's why they wanted to have free trade, and they wanted to have comparative advantage among countries. And as you said, they set up institutions to do it, an International Monetary Fund on exchange rates, a World Bank eventually starting as a European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, which would rebuild economies and actually would become a source of capital for countries coming out of colonialism. And in some ways, the most remarkable one, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which was not a set of trade agreements, but rules of the road to level the playing field so that the international economy could grow. So it was by its very nature supposed to get us away from conflict in the international system. They also worried, there she is,
welcome. Susan Rice.
Sorry to interrupt
No, I call Susan my little sister, even though we don't think we're actually related, even though we are both named Rice. We haven't done enough exploration of that. But just to return to this liberal order, because I think it's important to know what they were trying to avoid. And so they hated the fact that there'd been beggar thy neighbor trading policies and competition over resources that was violent. So they weren't going to do that again. Then the important fact, they were going to try to create the democratic peace where they could, so they rebuilt Germany as a democracy, Japan as a democracy, and it was all going to be protected by American military power. And so that was the liberal order. I think it is being challenged by China, although China has one foot in and one foot out. It is being challenged by Russia because Russia, unfortunately, doesn't really have a foot in the economic side and therefore uses its military power for its respect. But it's also being challenged by the four horsemen of the apocalypse: populism, nativism, isolationism, and protectionism, and they tend to run together. And so one of the questions that we ought to be asking is not just the challenge to the liberal order from transnational terrorism or cyber warfare or from big powers like Russia and China, but how do we deal with the fact that it does seem that there are those who believe that they were left behind by the global order, and they're fighting back. They found people who will give them an answer as to why they didn't succeed. Populists always have an answer. It's the other, the Chinese, the illegal immigrants. If you're from the left, the big banks. And oh, by the way, the other this time around is not just taking your jobs, the other is dangerous. So refugees and immigrants. And so I think the challenge is this time not just one that we foreign policy people can understand, but one that has to go internally to these societies and see what's happening. And that's why I'm glad for the Aspen Strategy Group that we are having this wonderful session that Mitch Landrieu will help to lead, because this is a really big challenge from the inside and from the out. And yes, I'm worried that the liberal order might not survive it.
Good. Thank you, Condi. I think we'll give Susan a breather. She can listen to a little bit of this. Welcome, by the way. Yeah. The question is, Susan, is the liberal order weakening? Is American leadership of that order weakening? So maybe I'll go to Tom. We'll alternate Republican. We have 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats. Tom, your views, and let me just put a little English on this. America first, part of the problem of a weakening America?
Thank you, Nick. It's great to be here today. You know, just to reinforce one thing you said, you know, we have in our country today deep polarization, and not a lot of conversation takes place across political lines. Not a lot of conversation takes place in the policy world, in the domestic side. It does take place in the foreign policy and national security arena, and we're very lucky for that. And this institution that Joe and others put together have been a really important part of that. So you have almost 2 decades straight through of service on the stage here today, and I think it is kind of a manifestation of something very important for us to continue. I think in terms of our national security. Condi's description of the U.S.-led, and that's the most important thing, I think, post-World War II world order. It's important to underscore that this would not happen without the United States, and it will not continue without the United States, frankly, and we can't take it for granted. You know, essentially, you know, her description of what was put in place after World War II has led to, and again, with a lot of problems and a lot of challenges and mistakes, but the overall arc of the story is enormously positive. Enormously positive for the United States with respect to prosperity and its security, and enormously positive for large parts of the world. And I do think it's under pressure, and I think one of the key element here is continued U.S. leadership of that. You know, the thing after World War II, among others, was that the United States did not act like a normal country trying to seek hegemony. Right? That was not the play that the United States ran after World War II. It was an entirely different approach, really putting together organizations that we would participate in as real participants, and that would have benefits for the rest of the world. The provision of public goods, pursuing a values-based foreign policy. We weren't not a normal country, right? Any other country. The United States engaged in a very special undertaking after World War II. On the pressure on the order today, I think it has all the sources that Secretary Rice laid out, among others, though. I mean, we really have seen now the reemergence of great power competition, I think. We had an extraordinary period after the fall of the Berlin Wall, where there was a quite high degree of constructive and productive relations among and between the great powers. And I think that has, in significant part, come to an end, particularly with respect to Russia, who, after the return of Vladimir Putin in 2012, has decided to go in a different direction, and it presents real challenges to the world order and real challenges to the United States. My own view is that Russia has become actively hostile across the board to the United States. We've also seen the emergence of a ideological challenge, frankly, to the world order and the values that the United States pursued successfully. And that ideological challenge comes from illiberalism and comes from authoritarian regimes who are making their case around the world, frankly. And history's back. Frank Fukuyama famously said that we'd reached the end of history. Well, history is back with a vengeance here, I think. And third, we've seen the really kind of the breakdown of the state system in the Arab world. And that has had enormous external impacts, including the emergence of entities, violent entities who filled the vacuum like ISIS. And this all presents tremendous challenges, but I think at the end of the day, I'll finish up on this, another challenge to this really is questions about whether or not the United States is going to continue to lead this. And during the course of the campaign, and during the course of the first 6 months of the administration, there have been real questions raised about the U.S. Commitment to the basic pillars of that world order in terms of alliances and in trade, multilateral institutions, and multilateralism generally. And I think the United States is incumbent on us, I think, given the questions that have been raised, to engage in a very serious set of steps, including significant reassurance with our allies.
Thank you very much. When Joe and Condi and I thought about this meeting, what we didn't want to do was have this to be some kind of a verdict on the Trump administration. And we also didn't want to presume that the liberal world order is perfect. So the question we'll be looking at over the next couple of days is what needs to be fixed? How should it evolve? And Steve, in that respect, in the scene setter written for this weekend, there was a paragraph basically saying, here are the problems with America first, but there was another paragraph that said, Trump is bringing new ideas. A lot of Americans are concerned that free trade has undercut them personally and undercut their industries, the industries that they worked in. And it's a very aggressive policy against the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, for instance. So you might be best placed as a student of this, you're not in the administration, to give us a sense of how you view America first fitting. Is it in the continuum of every president since Truman? Is it a diversion from it? Should the administration make some changes to it?
I'd like to blow it up a little bit bigger than that, because the question is, so what do we do about all this? And I'll give you one vignette. Brookings Institution brought together 5 Republicans, 5 Democrats before the election to talk about this rules-based international order. And the whole tenor of the discussion was, we got to defend it, we got to defend it, we got to defend it. And then the election occurs. And it was interesting to see the change of mood and dialogue within that group. Because what we saw with the Trump election is a group of people, as Condi said, who felt that they were victimized by globalization, threatened by immigration, ignored and excluded from the politics, and betrayed by the elites. And suddenly what this group began to say was, well, maybe we've got to amend and revitalize that liberal international order. 1, to reflect the fact that many people feel left out by it. 2, to reflect the fact that the world has changed. We now have the advent of China and India and other new players. And 3, the fact that we now have this new ideological struggle that Tom talked about. Interestingly enough, the question is, can this administration be convinced that is in its interest to lead a process to revise and revitalize the international order? And it was interesting, I was in Warsaw to hear President Trump's speech, and he talked a lot about Western civilization and the defense of Western civilization. I talked to some of his people afterwards and said, someone needs to explain to him that this rules-based international order has been a framework for defending all the values of Western civilization that he was talking about. He wants other countries to do more, not the United States being taken advantage of. So let's try a recast and revitalized international order that lets other countries like China and the like have a hand in trying to amend that order, so that they in some sense are taking more responsibility and are more bought into it. And at that point you may be able to say to President Trump, The world is stepping up the way you ask them to do, but they can't do it alone. The United States remains, as Madeline says, an indispensable party to the future. I think that's our challenge.
Thanks. Susan, you've heard all this. Your view on our role in the world. What's happened to it?
Well, I think our role is, as Madeline has said so many times, is and remains indispensable. And what we are suffering, I think, fundamentally is a view of the world and a view of our domestic politics as zero-sum. And our leadership in the post-world world has never been zero-sum. It has benefited from the concept that we can maximize benefits through strong, principled American leadership. And now, to the extent that we have gone through a phase of us versus them domestically, and I think Candy's characterization of that was very apt, the other, but it's becoming the same in our relationships with many parts of the rest of the world. Even our closest allies are looking at the United States and questioning whether we are leading a team of principled, like-minded, values-based entities, or whether or not we are going to stand in opposition to them, much less our own adversaries. And we need to reform that vision of United States leadership through a combination of reasserting and embracing the fact that America's leadership can be beneficial not only for us but for others, that we have a system of alliances and of trade that has served us very well, and it is not in our interest to see those eroded or jettisoned. And that requires a whole new approach, a renewal of our relationships that we have frankly suffered from, I think, over time, but I think also, frankly, over the last 6 months.
I agree completely that we need to revitalize and reassure, but we need help from our allies too. I mean, who are we kidding? How many of us on this stage gave that 2% GDP to our NATO allies and kept saying, please, please, can't you just carry more of the burden, right? We all did. And we basically got nowhere.
Well, no, we've seen some improvement.
Susan, in the large scheme of things, we got nowhere. Over a long period of time, the United States has carried most of the burden. Now, I believe great powers have to be willing to do that. But I've been saying to our allies, we actually could use a little help here. Step up, and it will be appreciated if we start to see greater engagement. I always felt a little bit sometimes as Secretary of State that the Secretary of State, and Madeline would know this, is the 911 for the world. And so if there's a problem, it's, why don't you solve that problem? The one exception was the Australians, who would actually call up and say, hey, we got this one, mate, and so we'll call you if we need it. But I do think some broader sharing of, if you want to call it the burden, would be a very good thing. And then one other thing to the Chinese, I would say. The Chinese have really, really benefited from the liberal economic order. They would not have lifted 500 million people out of poverty without it. They were admitted to the World Trade Organization probably prematurely. And if you look at Chinese practices, they are not in line with World Trade Order, with the World Trade Organization's standards. So, for instance, intellectual property protection is a problem. If you have a joint venture partner with China, you're likely to see your intellectual property taken, and the joint venture suddenly owns it. National champions among Chinese companies are advantaged vis-a-vis Western companies. The Chinese have not opened their financial services sector to investment as they are supposed to do under the World Trade Organization. So I am absolutely all for reasserting America's willingness to work with people and all of those things. I do think others have an important role to play here too, and that will be reassuring to the American people as well.
Thank you, Connie. Susan.
I kind of fully agree. I think we all would, that our allies and partners need to play a commensurate role. But the fact is, the reason why they call the United States and they call the State Department on 911 is because there isn't a country that matches our military, economic, and moral might. And whether the challenge is gathering a coalition to impose sanctions on Russia after they invade Crimea and Ukraine, whether it's rallying the world to deal with the Ebola epidemic, whether it's building a coalition to go after ISIS, it requires the United States to be front and center. It doesn't mean that others don't contribute. It doesn't mean that others shouldn't pull their weight. Obviously, they can and they must, and they don't always do so. But when we step back, nothing seems to work, and I think that's clearly been our collective experience.
Tom? Steve?
I just have one part of this, thinking about how to revise and revitalize the international order. I think we want others to do more. That means also we're going to have to give them more of a role and more of a stake. And that, I think, also means that we're going to have to change a little bit how we lead. We're going to have to be of a mind of sort of facilitating this kind of participation, not dictating, be responsive to other people's views, a little bit more and enabling and a little less imposing. Mary Robinson and I were having this conversation. I think we need a little bit of an adjustment in how we lead, because I think the world has changed. And I think to be effective and to get others to take more of the burden, as we all think needs to be done, we're going to have a little different leadership style.
Bob Kagan, the scholar at Brookings Institution, right, has a saying which is stuck with me, which is, we don't get to retire from this role. And we would retire from this role at a very high cost to ourselves and the world. So determining the way forward and reasserting and reassuring allies, really having a conversation with them about what it means to be an ally, right? And this conversation, I think, has gotten off track. It's become too transactional, too contingent, right? These are fundamental obligations that we have to each other. Getting back into that conversation with the United States in the lead, and Steve, I think you're right, and doing it in a style and a manner and with a vision that's commensurate with the challenges we have, I think is the right way to go. But the United States doesn't get to retire from this role, and it's not in their interest to do so.
I think that's right. Last word on this, and I want to ask you about Russia, Condi, because you spent a lot of your life thinking about Russia at Denver. I think President Trump, I'm a former ambassador to NATO for Bush 43. And when we were hit hard on 9/11, the Allies came to us and said, we want to invoke Article 5 of the NATO treaty. An attack on one is an attack on all. We'd never invoked it in the history of NATO. And they came through for us big time. I did call Condi, 4 a.m. Washington time on September 12th. She had no sleep, to say that the Allies were going to be with us and they wanted to go to war with us against al-Qaeda. And boy, did I feel at that moment the power of having allies in the world. The Chinese aren't going to always be there. The Russians are never there, but the Allies were. And I think you said, to me, it's good to have friends in the world.
Yeah, it is good to have friends in the world. I recently gave a talk for the National War College, brought some of their students, and they were the foreign students. There were 49 countries represented in that room. No great power in human history's had 49 allies that close. I fully agree with that. But to Steve's point about how we're going to have to lead differently, I couldn't agree more. But leading differently obviously means finding a role for others. That's very important. But it also means, and I know, we can't retire from this role, but there is a weariness among the American people, and we can't ignore it. We can't, as foreign policy people, simply say, look, we've got to get back there and lead. We have to say, we're going to lead because it's in our interest, it's with our values, and our allies have to appreciate it, right? And they have to be a part of it. That's my point. I think we really haven't gotten from the allies. What we get mostly from the allies is criticism for not leading, because the only thing the world hates more than unilateral American leadership is no American leadership. But we do need our allies to step up, and some of them have. On Minsk, for instance, the Germans stepped up to try and settle the Ukrainian circumstances. But let's not underestimate, outside of foreign policy elites, the degree to which the American people are asking questions about how much more we can do.
Well, this is a good transition point to Russia, and let me just frame it this way. Since Putin's invasion and annexation of Crimea, 20 of the 28 allies have raised their defense spending. And they feel the threat. And I would even say right now, Merkel is leading NATO, not so much the United States. She's leading NATO on this. So, Condi, you've studied the Russians and the Soviets your whole life. We've got a dilemma here. Putin attacked our election and tried to discredit our democracy. We know he did that. Putin annexed Crimea. He still has troops in the Donbass and eastern Ukraine dividing that country. He has been a malevolent force in Syria. So what's the strategy for President Trump here? How does he respond to this? And we saw this extraordinary situation where the president was essentially repudiated by the Republicans in Congress on this big vote in the Senate and House to sanction Russia. If you were to give advice to him, what would it be? Not to put you on the spot too much.
Well, thanks. Well, the first advice I would give is be sure you know who Vladimir Putin is. Right? And Vladimir Putin is someone who likes to humiliate, someone who likes to dominate, and someone who essentially understands power. And so don't go into a room with Vladimir Putin unless you are in a pretty powerful position. And that means when you go to talk to Vladimir Putin, first, let's continue the policy that the Obama administration began, maybe even accelerate the policy of putting forces at least on a rotating basis, but possibly on a permanent basis in places like Poland and the Baltic states, so that you say to him, this far and no further. Secondly, I like raising the defense budget as a signal to the Russians. Third, I think you have to say to the Russians, we know you did it on the electoral process. We will, at a time of our choosing, by means of our choosing, we will deal with it, but we have confidence in our electoral system, so don't think that you're undermining American confidence by what you're doing, because he feeds on this sense that he's succeeding in undermining our confidence. And the final thing that I'd say to him is stop flying your planes so close to our ships and aircraft, somebody's going to get shot down. Because once you've established the kind of ground rules with Vladimir Putin, now you can talk about possible areas of cooperation. By the way, there's one other thing I'd do. I'd arm the Ukrainians. I think that you have got to raise the cost to the Russians of what they're doing in Ukraine. And it's not on the front pages anymore. But in eastern Ukraine, people are dying every day because of those little Russian green men, the Russian separatists who, with Russian military training and Russian military intelligence and Russian military capability, are making a mess of eastern Ukraine and making it impossible for Kiev to govern the country. And so I think it's time to arm them. In other words, I think you have to show him that you're tough, and then maybe you can find some areas of cooperation.
Thank you. Susan and Tom, what Condi, I think President Obama actually put in place a lot of what Condi's saying. Is there bipartisan agreement on this tough policy?
I think there's certainly bipartisan agreement on the steps that Condi described that we characterized as the European Response Initiative, where we got NATO with our leadership to put in those 4 countries, the 3 Baltics plus Poland, a continuous rotating augmented presence and forward deployed not only personnel but equipment. And we have reversed the trend of the downsizing of our presence in Europe, and that's vitally important. But I think beyond that, quite frankly, if we're going to tackle the very real challenge that Russia poses, we have to acknowledge the problem. We have to name it, as some people like to say on other topics. And here the reality is, with a president that has not expressed with clarity his understanding of what the Russians did to meddle in our election, and has been even unwilling to make a statement after the expulsion of our personnel from Russia, and offered no indication that we might respond ourselves in kind, because we are the aggrieved party in this instance. We are muddying the water and sending to Putin and the Russians the signal that we don't understand that we face from them a very serious threat. So we need to be very clear and forceful and unified in our characterization of the Russia problem. I think we've seen from Congress very useful and credible bipartisan leadership now on this topic. Thankfully, the legislation has been passed and signed. But this shouldn't be the end. I mean, the penalties should continue and they should be increased if nothing improves.
So Tom, you began, to build on what Susan just said, you very nicely framed this whole liberal order by recalling the origins of it. Are we back to containment of Russian power in Eastern Europe, not so much in other parts of the world? Is that the strategy that you pursued, you and Susan and President Obama? Is that what Trump should do?
Well, I mean, as I said earlier, it's important to recognize some of the fundamentals here, right? Which is that we are in an actively hostile posture with the Russians right now. And it's not just in Europe. It's in Syria, it's in Afghanistan, it's in Syria, and it was in our own elections, and it'll be in the European elections going through the next year as well. And it'll probably be in our elections, 2018 and 2020, unless we act to prevent it. So we're in, I think, in an actively hostile posture with the Russians coming from their side. I met with Putin the Friday night before he was inaugurated in 2012, and it was clear at that point that we were going, and he was going to take Russia in a different direction, and that these concepts of balance of power, sphere of influence, zero-sum outcomes were not anachronistic ideas to Vladimir Putin. They were very real ideas. He also had a domestic pressure on him, I think, that had forced him and pushed him in the direction that he'd gone. And he had his own sense of where Russia should be, but a very different place from where just before that we had Russian generals planning with us, as you know, Nick, as well as anybody, at NATO headquarters. So we had a very big change here, and I think it's important for us to recognize that. Second, what Secretary Rice describes, I think, is exactly right, and I think there would be bipartisan agreement on basically strengthening our position in Europe. That's essentially what those 4 or 5 steps are about. And I think before you kind of enter into a serious conversation with Putin about what the rules of the road are going to be going forward, you have to do it from a position of strength. I think Condi's exactly right about that, and the steps that she laid out are exactly right. The last thing I'll talk about is the election. It is important that there be a recognition from the top as to what happened. And it's important that we have, and I believe that everybody else in the administration, short of the president, has actually said this, including a number of people here, Walter, last week at the Security Forum. But it's important that we move forward with a set of steps to prevent this from happening in the future. We had a set of events. We know what the playbook was. We know what its dimensions were, from cyber aspects to it, propaganda aspects to it, actually penetration of election systems maybe in 3 dozen states. And we need to take steps now, I think, to prevent it from happening in the future. We've been put on notice with respect to this threat.
Steve, you're the transitional figure on the panel. I want you to say what you want on Russia. Then I want to ask you about China, my final question.
Well, I may provoke a little controversy on the panel on this. I agree with everything that has been said and all the measures that Condi talked about. I'm no softy on Russia. I've been writing and arguing for those for the last 2 or 3 years. And making and calling out what Russia did in terms of our election, and making sure, as Tom said, it can never happen again by anybody. First, shame on him. You fool me twice, shame on me. We should never let this happen again. But I'm a little worried. I think we're in a dangerous period with Russia. I think Putin has decided that Americans are just anti-Russian, as his ambassador says all the time. There's no constituency for U.S.-Russian relations in the United States. And he's basically saying, well, if you think I'm an enemy, I'm going to show you what it's like to have an enemy in Russia. And we are vulnerable, because as much as I applaud the steps of what we've done, I don't think they're enough if Putin really decides to press us. I'll give you an example. We're putting battalions, we NATO, putting battalions in the 3 Baltic states and in Poland and in Bucharest. Battalions, are 1,200 people, 1,500 people. Russia is going to have an exercise in Belarus that newspaper reports suggest maybe up to 100,000 people and 8,000 tanks. I think I've got that number right.
This month.
More tanks than Germany, France, and UK have combined. And we have to be careful that we don't get in this, very confrontational, rhetorical position with Russia and not have the resources to back it up. I think we're not doing enough in Europe. I think we're not doing enough in Syria. Putin is doubling down, and we've pulled the plug on some of the things in Syria. So I think we're in an exposed position. And what we've got to do is to be very tough, stand on our principles, stand on our allies, making it clear that we are prepared to deter Putin, but at the same time be willing to try to improve the relationship and cooperation. Because what is the formula America has used for 4 or 5 decades about adversaries, from the Soviet Union to our most troublesome adversaries? It is cooperate where you can, where you have common interest, stand on your principles, stand with your friends, and be tough where you disagree, but manage those disagreements that it doesn't end up into confrontation and conflict. That we've got to get back to that formula, and we're not there right now. And I think it means it's a risky period.
Before Steve goes to China, before you get to China, just to add on to that, if I were advising the current president, I would give him the same advice, but it would be easier to get to a place where we could engage in a conversation with the Russians, and we wouldn't have the kinds of restrictions, frankly, placed on the president out of the sanctions package that was placed there, if in fact we had been tougher on this and straighter on this and clearer on this. I do think that would be the advice that I would give, that we can get to a place to be tougher, deal from strength, and we would have a better opportunity to have a conversation with some domestic support if in fact we acknowledge these problems.
And Steve, my sense is that you've articulated a bipartisan consensus of sorts that exists in Washington now on how to approach the Russians. Final question. Let's do a quick run through, then we'll take questions from the audience. Joe and Graham Allison and I had a colleague at Harvard, Steve Bosworth, the late Ambassador Steve Bosworth. Here's how he framed our relationship with China in one of my classes at the Kennedy School 2 years ago. He said, China is not our enemy. In fact, China will likely end up being one of our most, if not our most important global partner in the 21st century on climate change, on stabilizing and growing the global economy, on all those transnational threats, the role of women, cyber in the future. He said, here's the problem. China is also a competitor with us for strategic power in East Asia. Think the South and East China Sea military superiority. So Steve asked a question of my students that I want to ask of you. He said, this will be the toughest American challenge on foreign policy in the 21st century, to balance these two and not to let them get out of balance and not to end in a conflict with China, but not to be dominated by China. And in my view, if I can say this in a nonpartisan way, President Obama achieved the climate change partnership with Xi Jinping. Good example of the engagement. Now President Trump faces a very assertive China in the East and South China Sea. So, Steve, start with you and we'll work right back down. What's your advice to President Trump on dealing with the Chinese? He seems disappointed if you read the recent tweets about Chinese behavior in North Korea. And I read all the tweets. I follow him on Twitter.
So I'll try to frame this, but a lot of people have a lot to say on it. It is a competitor. One of the problems is, someone said to me, the Soviet Union was a competitor, but they didn't really have the resources that was required to compete. Well, in China, we have a competitor that's got resources like crazy. And this is a different kind of competitive threat, I think, than we've ever faced. So we need to start on that. But it does require balance. So one, a revised international order. We need to find a way to see if we can bring China as part of that process to revising that order. Because if we do not give them a seat at the table in revising that order, they will take the lead and try to create a competitor. And that's not in our interests. Second, on issues like the South China Sea, I think the framework for handling it is pretty clear. Yes, we've got to stand with our allies in terms of South China Sea. We have to be present economically, militarily, in every other way. But I think we can manage that because China's integration in the international community and the fact that it's dependent on economic prosperity and growth for the legitimacy of the regime means that China doesn't really want to have a trade war with the United States, its neighbors, and Europe. So we've got some leverage there, and I think we can negotiate in some sense with shrewd diplomacy, but not if we provoke a trade war with China. Two issues I'm worried about. One, I think solution's easy. One Belt, One Road, this enormous Chinese infrastructure project that is reaching out westward. You know, it's a good thing. The Central Asia and elsewhere needs infrastructure, but what we need to do is not fight it. We ought to join it, and we ought to get all our friends to join it. I have a vision is we all get around China and we hug them on One Belt, One Road, because if you have 50 people hugging you, it's a little hard to move. What am I worried about? We used to say that the Taiwan relationship could destroy U.S.-China relations. I think the Taiwan issue is pretty well managed, quite frankly, and is manageable. I'm worried about North Korea and a confrontation between the United States and China and North Korea. And the last two administrations have both tried to have a discrete conversation with China about what do we do on the peninsula. I think my instinct from what I hear others is China may be finally ready for that conversation, but we have to have it. Because if we don't manage that issue correctly, we could have a confrontation with China.
Thank you. Tom?
Yeah, go. Yeah,
Susan.
we'll come back.
So, obviously, the relationship with China is not only the most complex, but I would argue the most consequential bilateral relationship we have in the world. And that requires us to do just as Steve said when he was talking about Russia. It's to maximize cooperation where we can, manage competition and avoid confrontation. And I think here in the last several years, we've managed to strike that balance quite well. Not only on climate change were we able to find new areas of cooperation, but on peacekeeping, on global public health, on a whole range, non-proliferation, nuclear security. There were a whole range of areas where with painstaking and sometimes frustrating diplomacy, and Tom and I both spent a lot of our time directly engaging our Chinese counterparts, we were able to expand the areas of cooperation into realms that were previously unthinkable. At the same time, we managed to whittle down some of the areas of greatest difference. And one of the areas that was a source of extraordinary friction, it's not gone, but it's certainly mitigated, is in the cyber realm, where we were able to negotiate an understanding with the Chinese that they've largely adhered to, where they would cease the theft of our intellectual property through cyber means for commercial gain. And we agreed to a series of cyber norms that took down the temperature and reduced the level of nefarious activity from the Chinese side. That's something we need to continue to watch and to manage. But I agree with Steve, there are areas of real concern. I'm still quite concerned about the South China Sea and potentially the East China Sea. And I think we haven't yet, particularly in recent months, figured out how front and center we will put that issue in the bilateral relationship. And I think North Korea, as important as that is, can't overshadow our attention to that issue. And on North Korea, Steve, I'd be interested in hearing how you play out the scenario of ending up in U.S.-China direct confrontation over that. But I do think what we risk is our very understandable frustration with the failure to address the problem sufficiently, leading to miscalculations on our side or on the part of the North Koreans or our allies, such that we end up on a slippery slope. And we can spend more time on North Korea, but I think those are the two issues of North Korea, South China Sea, where the competition could end up in a worst-case scenario resulting in confrontation.
Thank you. And I think I imagine someone's going to ask about North Korea. Tom and Condi, last words on the China relationship.
Well, I'll say a couple of broader things. Number one, I think, is that the China relationship has to be nested in your overall Asia policy, the U.S. overall Asia policy. From this perspective, Condi said it exactly right earlier, is that few nations on the face of the earth have benefited more from the U.S.-led and supported security and economic order over the last 75 years. And for the Chinese, the last 40 years have been extraordinarily beneficial for them. And that is largely built on the platform, the security platform, the engagement platform of the United States put in place in Asia, on which Asia's social and economic development has been built. And so I think it's a first strategic point is that continued presence by the United States, that continued commitment to our role as an important power, the premier power in the Pacific, is absolutely essential. Because if you do the thought experiment and you ask what happens absent that, you have a place full of conflicts, right? And real challenges with respect to economic and other kinds of development. So I think that's the first point. The second is on the we have cooperating, I think, quite well with the Chinese on a number of global issues, but we have these regional issues which are quite significant. And I would list three. I would go back again and add the economic issues as well. We have, and I agree, Steve, we don't want to get to a trade war with the Chinese, but we have really serious economic problems with the Chinese right now. There is lack of reciprocity. There is lack of access. It is becoming increasingly difficult for the United States and foreign firms generally to do business in China. There are real technology transfer issues, and these have to be, I think, confronted. China has a big investment in the global economic environment. They have a big investment in us, frankly, right? As their most important market. They have to be pushed much harder to play by the rules, I think. And the other two, I think, as Susan said, the South China Sea is a place where, my first point, where we need to maintain our presence and insist on the right rules of the road in the South China Sea. And North Korea is the most, probably the most perilous security issue facing us over the next year and a half or so. And Graham Allison's described it, I think, Joe, as a slow motion Cuban Missile Crisis. And I think there are a number of steps I think we can talk about. I think that we can take in addition to what's happening right now. But it's the principal security conversation with the Chinese.
Thank you, Connie.
I would just add one thing. There is a wild card, and that's China's internal development. And that's something that we can't control. China is going through a massive transformation. It's not all going well. The low cost of labor, heavy export, heavy government investment, strategy that they pursued to lift those 400, 500 million people out of poverty, that prosperity as legitimacy, that model's kind of run out of steam. And they've had great reform plans. They're going to close down SOEs, state-owned enterprises. They were going to introduce more market forces, but there's a little problem. When you start to introduce market forces, you start to introduce a lot of voices. And that doesn't set easily with a top-down political system that, if anything, is getting more and more concentrated in the hands of a very few, if not one. And so the internal developments of China are something that we don't control. And how that will play out in the externalization of their policies in the South China Sea or in trade policy, I think it's very hard to say. And so this management, careful management, is also going to have to be constantly attuned to what is transpiring in China.
Thank you. Thanks to this great panel, you've seen these four outstanding people all had the toughest job in Washington, I think. National Security Advisor, 2 for President George W. Bush, 2 for President Barack Obama. We owe you a lot. Thank you to all of you. So now it's your turn. If you would just motion to me if you want to ask a question. My only request would be you might stand up and there'll be a microphone that comes to you. We'll start right here. If you could just give us your name and make sure the question has a question mark attached to the end, and we'll all be happy. We'll get as many in as we can.
I am a mom and a local here, and I just have a question for you guys. You're very strong intellects. Who's intellectually on your level in this administration? Who's advising? Like, have you guys, Condoleezza Rice, I say this with respect, I'm not being sarcastic, have you studied Steve Bannon and his philosophy about the neoliberal order? What are your thoughts on that? And the second thing is, have you looked at the dark side of some of the supporters? Everyone's talking about the left behind American worker, but to me and to a lot of my brown friends and people that are not in an advantaged position, it's not so like soft and fuzzy like that. There's another element in the rallies, and I just want you to speak to that.
Who would like to, any comments?
Sure, I'll take it, certainly. Look, there are some very good and intellectually excellent people in this administration. Rex Tillerson is a very smart guy, and let me tell you something, oil men know the world like other people don't. They deal with difficult places, difficult people. He's a great intellect. Jim Mattis is probably one of the great intellects of the last half century in the American military, and so is H.R. McMaster. So yes, there's some very, very good and smart people around the president. I do know Steve Bannon's work, not particularly fond of it, but I think that we have to recognize that, as I said, when one has a kind of populist message, some other things tend to go with that message. And what we're seeing, at least on the foreign policy side so far, is that the foreign policy looks more traditional in a sense than I think many of us would have thought early on. If you look at the fact that we finally got around to affirming Article 5, took a little while, and attack upon one is attack on, we finally got around to it. We actually did agree that we did believe in a one China policy. It took a little while, but we got there. When you look at some of the discussions about what's going to happen to NAFTA, by the way, during the campaign, candidate Trump said this was the worst trade agreement ever created in human history. And now you look at what they actually are talking about in the renegotiations of NAFTA, it's pretty modest, because they've learned a particular reality, which is the one that Steve and I learned on a few days after September 11th. We closed the border with Canada a few days after September 11th. 3 days later, nobody could make a car because the supply chain was in Canada. So NAFTA is a fact, not a policy. And so I think if you look at a whole host of issues, issue by issue, I don't know that the Syria policy is that different than what one might expect, or to this point, the North Korea policy. I do think this bigger issue of are we going to reaffirm the broad context for all of those decisions, the liberal order, American leadership in it. What does America first really mean? Are we really not going to care about whether or not states are democratic? By the way, democracy promotion, democracy support, I like to call it, is not just the morally right thing to do, but actually democracies don't fight each other. They don't send their 10-year-olds as child soldiers. They don't traffic their women into the sex trade. They don't attack their neighbors. They don't harbor terrorists. And so democracies are kind of good for the world. And so when you talk about American interests and you say you're not sure that we ought to promote democracy, I'm not sure you've got a clear concept or a clear grasp on what constitutes American interests. And so I'm more worried about the large piece of this. I think on the individual policies, we're seeing not that much divergence, and it is a really good national security team.
There's a pretty good book on this issue of democracy that's been recently published, I understand.
By Condi Rice. So, question right here. Yeah.
Well, thank you. My name is Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. I just want to thank you for a wonderfully constructive and forthright panel. But I wanted to ask the panel to reflect on the issue that Steve Hadley talked about, which is this changing nature of American leadership. There are some areas where some other countries might be willing to do more if the US, if they could get a clear signal that the US was willing to let them. I'm talking of the area of international finance. In the international financial institutions, there have been, like the World Bank, the IMF, there have been indications other countries might want to step up to the plate and do a bit more. And it's frustration that they were not able to do so that led to the creation of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank by China and the New Development Bank by the other countries, Russia, China, India, and so on. So could you reflect, what might it look like if the US were willing to let others do more in leadership? What would be the elements that would be that leadership change? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. And for those who are not IR specialists, this is a very pointed question that for 70 years, 65 years, there's always been a European leading the International Monetary Fund, an American the World Bank. Countries like Nigeria, Indonesia, Turkey, India say, how about us? Why can't we lead these institutions? Is it a mistake not to open them up? That's what I heard you say.
Can I just also say the question was asked by a woman who knows of what she speaks, former finance minister of Nigeria, and really one who we all admired for your service there.
And a candidate for World Bank president.
Yes.
Truth be told. Well, look, I think this is a real conundrum because for the United States, we want to see the renewal and refreshing of the institutions that came out of the post-war era that we were the birth mother of. We don't have alternatives to the United Nations, to the Bretton Woods institutions, and they need to remain relevant for the 21st century. And Ngozi, I mean, you're pointing to a very particular and important challenge, but in the current context, it's even harder, in my estimation, for the United States to truthfully embrace the kind of reform that many countries think is necessary. For example, to look to the United Nations. Does the United States really want to give up our veto on the Security Council, which, many member states would love to see? Do we want to expand permanent membership and with it the veto? In theory, we profess openness to these issues. In practice, if we're honest, these are very difficult and consequential choices and would lead to a diminution of our international power. And I think the financial institutions is a somewhat different question, and one that I think we need to come to terms with. I mean, if you're sitting in our seats when we were in those jobs, and each of us, at least most of us, had a turn at who was going to be the next World Bank president, it was our job not to lose that leadership, right? But it's going to be lost at some stage, and the question is, do we do it gracefully and in a way that preserves our ability to be a preeminent force in these institutions that are so important to us? And I think it's very hard. This is a great place for an Aspen strategy group or a like-minded bipartisan group to come up with solutions, because a sitting administration will always find it difficult to be the one to basically abdicate the seat.
Steve.
I think to say that we need to have a sort of a redefinition of America's role doesn't mean it has to be redefined on every issue. And Susan and I would probably agree, though Nick will have a different view, and maybe Condi on the UN Security Council. But I think the financial area is one that's very interesting. There was just a conference here on development over the last 3 days, and one of the things I learned from it was the amount of resources that China is making available through their national banks, development banks, it very quickly are going to dwarf what everybody else is doing. And that's before you get the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank and some other things. So we can treat this as a threat and grudgingly sort of surrender some control, or we can view it as an opportunity. And one of the ideas that came out from this session on development, which was very interesting, was, and I think it was John Podesta who actually described the developing world's criticisms of the existing sort of Bretton Woods lending institutions, too conservative and all the rest. And of course, there are problems with the Chinese. They don't have the right kind of standards in order to ensure that investments are done in a transparent, non-corrupt way and support and benefit the countries that receive them. Is there a way that you can, in some sense, partner between the two, co-invest in the two, so that we can use our institutions to get the Chinese institutions to accept more international standards, but also have behind those institutions the heft of the resources that China seems to be willing to apply to the problem? That's, I think, the opportunity. And I just think we ought to be looking at those opportunities. They may not prove out. They may turn out not to be in our interest. But not to be open to them and engaging people like Ngozi to talk about that, I think would be a big mistake.
Thank you. Ambassador Korologos.
I'm Tom Korologos, a Washington swamp lord. First of all, I want to give a speech. I've worked with all 5 of you in various capacities. God, you guys are good. And I thank you for your service. You served your country and your administrations well. First of all, Nick, may I say parochially, Greece has committed and fulfills its NATO agreement.
For all the wrong reasons, but it has.
Susan talked on cyber. That's a coming problem. First of all, is a cyber attack an Article 5 attack? Where is NATO on that?
I think the Obama administration delved deeply into this. Yeah.
A couple things, Tom. You know, it is. It would depend on the nature of the attack, right, and how destructive it might be. You know, the general direction here is to have the physical laws of war apply in the digital world as well. But the bigger point I think you're making is really important, which is that this is a really critical new domain of vulnerability for the United States and the world. And it's coming from a number of sources. You know, we have nation states, and they are engaged in all manner of activity, from information warfare, like the Russian activity, to espionage, to destruction, like the Korean actions against Sony. We have hybrid organizations, which are kind of at the beck and call of these nation states, but hard to attribute. We have you have criminal gangs, right, who are engaged in this. You have vulnerabilities that your employees bring to the workplace every day that need to be addressed. We as a country, I think, need to address this as a much bigger issue. You know, the last 3 or 4 times, I think, Susan, the DNI, when has given his world threat report, right, the global threat report to the Congress, right, in the non-classified presentation, has said, and I think actually DNI Coates has also continued this, has said that the number one threat facing the country is in the cyber arena right now. When Jim Clapper first did this, I sat down and went through his testimony, and I said, "Are you sure about this?" Right, you know, and he said, "I'm sure about this," and he's turned out to be right. And as I said, the Senator Coates, DNI Coates has contended it, but we're nowhere near in terms of mind share, resources, and expertise where we need to be on confronting the cyber threat. It's very uneven. We've made a lot of progress, but we have really a ways to go. I chaired at Susan, the President's request, the President's Commission on Cybersecurity last year, and that was, you know, we had a number of conclusions, including that we're nowhere near in terms of this as a priority, and we have some real challenges. Last thing I'll say, because it's quite current, we have some real challenges coming just in the technology development area. You know, there's Internet of Things developments here, where we could have tens of billions of devices that could be hijacked by malign actors and used to attack systems, and we're not anywhere near developing standards for that. So we have a lot of work in this area, Tom, and it's really a critical piece.
Thank you. Yes, sir. Right here in the third row, about 6 people in.
Hi, I'm Bruce McEver. I'm wondering, given our, I think, inflated view of ourselves and our economy in the world, what role would Germany and Japan play going forward in the defense against Russia and China? And could they play a constructive role in that?
Susan or Condi?
Well, I think certainly in terms of Germany, Germany's been politically and diplomatically on the front lines when it comes to the issue of Ukraine. And Germany is a critical ally. But Germany and Japan have a similar problem, which is that they still do have a shadow of a legacy of World War II. The Germans far less than Japan, but both, it is a shadow that is perhaps not as much a problem for their neighbors as it is for them and for their populations. When Germans talk about Germany, they don't like to talk about German power. I can remember I was on the delegation that did the unification of Germany. And when President Bush would say, George H.W. Bush, to Helmut Kohl, a unified Germany, Helmut Kohl would say, within a unified Europe. Because Germany was not supposed to act on its own. Germany, untethered from others, was to be a problem. And you know that sometimes, even within the European Union, if somebody wants to say something really nasty, they will say, it's not Brussels, it's Berlin. And so the Germans have always been somewhat reticent of being too far out in front, and they've liked having American partnership in what they do to play the quite good role that they can play in Europe. In Japan, even more so, I think the case, that there are still a lot of unhealed wounds from World War II. And again, because the United States has been a partner for Japan, Japan has been able to play a role. So the United States doesn't get to retire from this role either. If Germany is going to step up or if Japan is going to step up, it's always better in partnership with the United States, just to keep the balances right in the region.
Susan, do you have a comment? on this?
I agree completely with what Gandhi just said.
I would just add one note on this. The five of us have worked together in lots of administrations. We tended to look toward Britain in the 70s, 80s, 90s as our primary strategic partner. With Brexit and with the problems within Britain and the weakening of their military, there's no question, I think for Susan and Tom, Germany's become our lead partner. And one of the things that I think has been a mistake with President Trump, he describes Germany as an economic competitor. And yet he doesn't talk about Germany as our leading strategic partner in Europe. Merkel is our great ally. And I think if I could offer one bit of advice to the Trump administration, boy, you need a better relationship with Angela Merkel than you have right now. Because if she's returned her party on September 24th, she's our key ally. I don't know, Susan, if you reflect on that.
We're all in trouble because we won't have the anchor role that they're playing. But I think Germany's absolutely critical. Nick, I agree with your characterization completely. But the other thing we need to be recommitting ourselves to is the idea of Europe and a Europe that is strong and unified and shares our values. And when we see what's going on in Poland and Hungary, and we see Russia working very hard to exacerbate these divisions, our challenge is magnified. And then we have to figure out, with Brexit, how do we keep Britain fully in the fold? And how do we even envision a future where they may come back?
This I think is really important point about the United States' role in Europe. And one is I do think it's important to have this conversation with the Germans about the nature of what an alliance is, which we were talking about earlier, and really the critical role that Chancellor Merkel has played. But I also think because we haven't really of late been fully embracing of the European institutions. In fact, we embraced a number of individuals and organizations and political parties who would undermine these institutions, frankly, right? It's important for us to embrace these institutions, as Susan was saying. It's important for us to be more involved in Europe. I think, Gandhi's point on putting defensive arms more in Ukraine, I think becoming involved in the Minsk process, I think actually having a view on how the Brexit negotiations should turn out. The United States has a view on these things, right? And we shouldn't be shy about expressing those views, frankly.
Thank you. We have time for, I think, one more question, and then I want to ask our four panelists, whatever is asked, once you answer that question, any final thoughts on American leadership? This is really the core of what we're talking about this weekend. Congresswoman, former member of Congress, Jane Harman's a member of our group. She's a great friend. Jane?
Thank you. Fabulous panel. The liberal order is essentially a multilateral concept, and the organizations that grew out of it are multilateral. And yet President Trump sees things much more in bilateral terms. By throwing overboard TPP, he said he can cut better deals with each of the countries. So I guess my question is the bilateral approach a productive approach in an age like this?
And is it sufficient, I think? Right. So this is a good final question for each of you, and take it where you want to take it. If there's some issues we haven't covered that you want to cover, please do. And maybe Steve will start with you.
Well, I'm going to answer Jane's question in a roundabout way, and I'm going to start with something that Madeleine Albright says. And if I get it wrong, please stand up and correct me, as you are free to do. Madeleine is wont to say that Americans don't much like multilateralism. It has too many syllables and it ends with an ism. And that's the problem. And I think it's this problem of role in the world. Look, we up here, we all grew up in the Cold War era. We, had the rules-based international order in our bones. We understood what has happened in World War II and the Cold War and how important that was and the era of peace and prosperity that it ushered in. But we're heading off the stage, and people in their 20s and 30s don't have that shared experience, and we are not teaching them that history. And they do not understand what we feel in our bones. And it spills over in terms of the issue of the rules-based international order and America's role in the world. They have in some sense grown up on the fear of 9/11 and the lack of instant success in Iraq and Afghanistan. They don't understand what we did after World War II in terms of Germany and Japan to help remake those countries as some of our closest and most prosperous allies. So we have a huge gap. And if we are going to reassert American leadership in any form, if we are going to lead the process of a revitalized international order, we've got to take that case to the American people. I think we can, because I think Susan, I think where there is a crossover point is what Condi started off on. Trump reflected the American people's views that friends and allies need to do more. And if we can say that we're going to lead a process of adapting the international system, which has at its core, allies are going to step up, and as Ngozi says, they're going to be allowed to step up and take more responsibility, I think we may be able to sell that to the American people.
Yeah, Jane, on your question on multilateral versus bilateral trade negotiations, so President Obama led a negotiation to put together TPP, which was about 70% of world trade, 12 nations, and we pulled out on it. It was a terrible mistake. It was a mistake economically, and it's a mistake strategically, because it really was part of what I talked about earlier, which is the U.S. presence, which has been the work of multiple administrations on a bipartisan basis for a long time in Asia, really kind of pulling that economic presence out, that alternative, if you will, to other paths forward was I think, a critical mistake, and it will take years to replace that. And indeed, Secretary Rice talked about the NAFTA negotiations, and what's really happening in the NAFTA negotiation is that we're importing a number of the concepts for the modern economy that were developed for the TPP negotiation. So it's quite a thing. On the leadership issue, I'd say just two things, Nick, if I could, Nick, closing. One is, I think Steve's exactly right. There needs to be kind of a full-throated appreciation and endorsement by leaders of the international order that the United States has led, and have a keen understanding and presentation of what that's provided us. But last point is that, as we started out talking about here, the West and the democracies have to work. Right? And they have to work for a broader part of our population. And that really, at the end of the day, if you did a assets and liabilities chart, right? There's a lot of financial people in the room here, I know, right? You do kind of assets and liabilities on the United States. We've got a long list of assets. On the liability side, though, is really the future of work and expanding prosperity to more people. And I think that, at the end of the day, may be the most important thing we need to do for our national security.
So Jane, to your question, I mean, whether you're talking about in the economic sphere or the security sphere, the bilateral is, as I think Nick was hinting with his reformulation of the question, necessary but far from sufficient. And if you don't like the term multilateralism, which I agree is a mouthful, I'd prefer the term collective action. We need collective action to deal with many of the most pressing threats we face, whether we're talking about cyber threats or terrorism or pandemic flu, or proliferation, or climate change, all failed states. All of these are challenges that only can be dealt with effectively through collective action. And more often than not, it's us leading the pack, which is back to the whole point of how our leadership is so indispensable. And so it's both and. And I share the implied concern in your question, which is that if we look at everything through a bilateral lens, which is inherently forces one into a transactional mode, then we're back to the zero-sum mentality that I fear is undermining our leadership. Last point I'd make, Nick, and we haven't really talked about this, but I think one of the threats to the liberal world order and to American leadership is our own domestic politics, and the fact that we are now so internally divided that we can't even agree on the necessity of responding to a critical, pernicious external threat, and Russia being the most proximate example. We have got to get our act together internally, domestically, or we will be absenting ourselves from international leadership and, sprinkling holy water on the liberal world order. And that is a problem we can fix.
Could I just say before Condi has her chance to answer this question, one of the things that Walter has done, and Jim and Bob and lots of other people, is can Aspen be a convening place, nonpartisan? Can we heal the country? Can we overcome these divisions? Because there's a direct connection between that question and what we have lived with in foreign policy. It's a great point.
So, Jane, I think it takes both, and sometimes actually multilateralism is really bilateralism strung together. And so I think it takes both, but obviously some of the great institutions that we created are ones in which we believe that collective action would bring about a positive sum game in international politics, not a zero-sum game. And I think that was the great insight after World War II. But you know, to do that, it took confidence. It took confidence for a United States that probably enjoyed 55%, 60% of the world's GDP to say, no, we're not going to protect that. We're going to build a free trading system in which everybody can prosper. It took confidence with the Soviet Union astride half of Europe and having exploded a nuclear weapon 5 years ahead of schedule in 1949 to say, we're going to take a pledge, an attack upon one is an attack upon all, and you bet we will trade, if necessary, New York for London. That took confidence. And so what I am concerned about is our confidence these days. And it is in part that the American people are wondering how much longer does this have to go on. But you know, the American people also don't like what they see when we do withdraw. They don't like seeing Syrian babies choke on gas. They don't like seeing people beheaded on television as ISIS rises. They don't like seeing the Russians on the march. And so I think there's something to appeal to Americans to say, well, yes, I know that we've been at it a long time, but as Tom said, we can't retire. But the confidence piece of it, I'm really concerned about, because I think what we really are seeing is a split between those who are moving easily and capably in this global elite and those who aren't. You know, if I teach a course at Stanford in the business school, I'll have a student with roughly the following characteristic: born in Chile, went to college in Oxford, did their first job in Shanghai. Now they're in graduate school at Stanford, and their next job's going to be in Dubai, and they move easily around the world. And in fact, most people never move more than 25 miles from where they were born. And we're getting a split. We're getting a split between the aspirations and the fears and the prospects of people who are moving easily in this globalized environment and those who are being left behind. And those people who don't have the skills and who can't keep up and can't find a way to have the dignity that comes with having a decent job, yeah, they're saying, do you hear me now? And if we are continuing down a road in which we're going to have third graders who can't read, and we're going to have 18-year-olds who can't find a job, and 50-year-olds who are opioid addicted, I can assure you that we're going to be two countries, one capable and one not. And for a country that is held together not by ethnicity or nationality or religion or blood, but rather by a belief and aspiration. You can come from humble circumstances, you can do great things. It doesn't matter where you came from, it matters where you're going. That split is going to be devastating. And then we're not going to lead because we're not going to lead from confidence. And so I just want to underscore what this panelist said. This starts at home. Not America first. That's terminology that I don't like. But it does start at home because it was a confident America that built the liberal order. And it has to be a confident America that sustains it.
Wonderful. Thank you for being here. Walter, thank you for convening us. Thank you.